I am Roxanne Petraeus, and I'm so excited to moderate this discussion. Joined by so many of you, the chat is already fun, so that's always a good indication of a lively crew. What I'm going to do is briefly introduce our panelists and then let them each say a couple of things. Then I will segue into the agenda, what we're going to be talking about. I feel like all four of us have a strong preference for a true conversation, so if you have a thought, a question, an idea, please do pop it into the chat. You can use the Q&A function as well. We reserve time at the end of the discussion for dedicated Q&A, but I feel confident with this group that we really do like it to be a conversation throughout, so don't feel like you need to sit on any particular question or observation or anything like that. With that out of the way, let me introduce this really lovely crew. I'll go one by one, starting with Susan. So we have Susan Divers, but she answers to both Divers and Divers, as I confirmed in the prep call, despite having known Susan for quite some time at this point. Susan is a former Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, a real thought leader in the space who's just spent a lot of time familiarizing herself with the research, kind of best practices, always staying up with the latest and greatest, including now for Ethena as an advisor. So staying really close to our product to make sure that we stay up to date on everything. And she's also, I hope I don't spoil anything here, Susan, releasing a podcast where she's bringing on phenomenal guests to help us all keep sense of the changing regulatory landscape because it certainly feels like every time you open up the newspaper, some sort of guidance as to what's going on can be really helpful. Susan, what
Thanks,
did I?
Roxanne. Yeah, thanks, Roxanne, and delighted to be back at Ethisphere.
Wonderful. Next in my little Zoom Square order, I'm so excited to be joined by Ryann Cheung from Visa. She's the Senior Manager of Ethics and Compliance, but a long time at Visa, but a long time expert in this space. And she's going to be joining us with a practitioner's mindset, given that she's sitting currently in the seat that I imagine many of our participants are sitting in, of facilitating an ethics and compliance discussion, training culture at Visa, as well as several other great companies. Ryann, what did I miss?
Yeah, nothing. Thank you for that kind intro. I will just say that my fun fact for the day is I just got back from a family trip to Japan and I got to pet a capybara for the first time. So, high
Wow.
recommendations. Check out the pet cafes if you find yourself in Tokyo.
This is very good. My son and I always look for the capybara at Trader Joe's, and then you get a lollipop. So not as fun as an actual capybara, but still very fun. And then last, we're so lucky to be joined by Douglas Allen of Ethisphere, because as I'm sure many of you do, I always look to Ethisphere for the greatest insights, reports. They just kind of put out these really thoughtful perspectives on the state of ethics and compliance. And Doug there is a vice president of data strategy. Doug, anything you want to add, including capybara anecdotes?
Well, thank you, Roxanne. I have two young children, so unfortunately, my trips to Japan are on pause for a few more years, but we have been and do love the country. So, doubling down on Ryan's recommendation. Beyond that, no, happy to be here. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat already from work we do here at this year, so glad to see so many friendly faces. Just one point of clarification on my background. I do live in the world of measuring and improving ethical culture with our partner companies around the world, so I kind of bring that lens specifically into how we'll talk about managers today and going forward. So thank you, Roxanne. Excited.
I, I love that because the data and insights piece and the measurement is obviously crucial. I think we can all have anecdata about managers, maybe some managers who we really loved and respected, and maybe some that didn't leave that impression. But I think having a comprehensive view of the data is so important because many of you operate at companies that are at just such a large scale that you really need that. Ace, if you can go to the next slide, please. So, what we are hoping to cover, admittedly a meaty agenda, is why managers matter. I think we all come to this call with a kind of a personal perspective on this, but we're going to be digging into, to Doug's point, the data. And then kind of a question of like what's standing in the way. I know when I was doing the prep call, I came to these experts kind of saying, like, it sort of feels like we all know that managers are really important. We all know that they don't always have the right like skill sets, training to deal with really tricky issues. And it is more like, what do we do about that? And so we're going to try to get as practical and honest as possible because I think that this is a space that's just really tricky. Like, I don't think any company feels like they have perfectly equipped every manager across their organization. So we really want to make sure that we are acknowledging that the inherent trickiness of this. And then we're going to move into practical ways to embed ethics into manager workflows because, we can sort of all have this ideal conception of a great program, but all of you have to deal with the reality of managers being very busy. What can you actually get done in a year? How much space does the, for example, ethics and compliance function really have in order to impact managers, et cetera? We'll talk about speak up culture. I think this is one of many areas where Ethisphere's data is so helpful in terms of understanding the impact of managers on speak up culture. And throughout, we'll be sprinkling this with examples from the field, or Susan, as you described it, war stories. All of that will be very welcome. Next slide, please. So we thought we would start off with a pulse question. This is, of course, entirely optional, but if you are interested, and I'm sure your peers would love it if you were, because I think that's often we walk away with these roundtable sort of feeling like, man, we're not alone. We'd love for you to just put 1 to 5 into the chat. There's no special survey function, truly just 1 through 5 in the chat. I feel confident that our middle managers see building an ethical culture as a core part of their job. I'm so grateful that you all are an active audience. It's very awkward when I have to sit here. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of 2s and 3s. That tracks with, like, again, my anecdata of me like really never coming across a 5. I was in the Army a long time ago, massive organization, very different than private sector, but still I think facing a lot of same challenges. And I think that this was like a kind of pervasive challenge there. Would love to open it up to the panelists. Anything surprise you about just, kind of the again, my anecdata of seeing a lot of 2s and 3s?
Roxanne, I can jump in here. I think when I was running a program and then when I was at LRN for 7 years, I saw this type of level of answer consistently. And it's because I think middle managers are the people who get squeezed between aggressive targets or aggressive schedules, and then the need to incorporate company values, which sometimes mean stopping in place and reevaluating what you're doing.
I think that tension is huge. I feel like you see it a lot in all parts of an organization, but I often hear from our customers, maybe engineering, sales, those might be examples where, Susan, if I read between the lines, what you're saying is like a sales manager might be hearing 2 things. Yes, yes, ethics, and also really tight quarter, gotta hit our numbers. And that tension, if you're a manager, can feel like, I'm hearing 2 different things. Ryann, I'm seeing nodding, would love to hear your, practitioner's perspective here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a great position at Visa because trust is so foundational to our brand that I
Yep.
do think that middle managers, um, it's that difference between building ethical culture and then knowing how to and how often to talk about it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the, but you're right, they are squeezed from a variety of, right, like HR is asking, get your performance reviews done and have those be wonderful, and compliance is sending messages about what you need to do, right, like all these different messages. And I think about, right, back in early in my career, people would describe themselves as a working manager. I don't think there are any people that are just managers anymore, right? Our
Yeah.
organizations just get leaner and leaner and leaner. And so you've got your day job work and then plus your people leader work.
I love that. Doug, anything to add?
Yeah, it's your point too, Ryan. On the front page of the Journal, Wall Street Journal today, is the article saying just how many large organizations are looking at workforce sizes and reducing them. Amazon, making the headline as well. So that's top of mind and very topical. Yeah, it's in looking at the question, Roxanne, it's a good question, but if I was in the seat of our participants today, I would have probably a hard time answering it because when looking at our data and measuring culture as broad as we have, it really can be department, business, location specific as to how folks view those managers. Managers are different. And it's hard to paint a broad brush saying, oh, enterprise wide, we're about a 3. And perhaps many can do that, but it's been my experience. It really is a local microculture type of system and way of approaching managing it that can lend itself to be a challenge to kind of diagnose it broadly, but a lot of times different regions, different cultures in a geographic sense, or different businesses require their own approaches and context to ensuring that their managers are prepared. And the outcome of that may be different too. So it really can be a local problem dealt with at a global by a global team, which is very challenging.
I think that's such a great point. I was talking to one of our customers, and she was a very global ENC function at a very global organization. And something she did to get at that is she essentially embedded a survey question very similar to this. That was, I think, something like I feel confident my manager knows how to handle a tricky situation. Something along those lines, a little bit more precise, but let's just say directionally it was that. And what she then did is took the lowest 10 scoring units, so maybe it was business unit. I'm not sure exactly how she sliced and diced the data. And then she spent her very limited, like exactly what you're saying, Doug, compliance functions are always strapped for time and resources. It's not reasonable for someone to go to the entire org and say, I'm going to train every manager, I'm going to handhold every one of you. So instead, she just spent her time on the lowest 10 performing business units or slices of data. And I thought that was such a good way to get at, Doug, what you're saying, which is this is often a very heterogeneous, distribution. And that's certainly what I saw at the Army. You could have one unit and one platoon within that unit might have had a pretty toxic culture, candidly, and the next platoon over was phenomenal, and it was entirely because of leadership.
If I can react immediately
Yeah,
to, it's a great
please.
approach, and it's a very common one we've seen implemented in practice. One piece of guidance that we lean on in that context is don't neglect your top performers too. They could be a
Mhm.
great case study. They
Great
could
point.
be a great network to lean on to educate perhaps lower performing groups in some of these contexts. So it's very easy to focus on those underperformers as evidenced by the data you collect, but there's a lot of good anecdotes and pilot programs you can generate from those top organizations that may be able to be replicated at scale and effectively across the organization.
Such a great insight. Ryan, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I would just the other thing that springs to mind is we asked a similar question on our survey data. It was funny because it wasn't a tricky situation, but it was specifically like my manager talks to me about ethics and compliance issues. And when
Sure.
you say to managers, they're like, I talk about this all the time, but then that's not reflected in the data. So I also think that there can be that disconnect of are people receiving that message as a compliance and ethics message so that when they see the survey question, it automatically connects. And I don't know that that's necessarily super important. Right. So it's also kind of thinking through some of those questions of like, how do we frame those discussions so that we're not like, here's your compliance message of the
Yeah.
day, too.
Siloed. I promise
Yeah.
we will continue moving through slides, but we got a couple of really great questions already. And one I think actually like we should pause to answer because it's going to permeate throughout. And then I promise we'll go into the next slide. So someone writes, what is company culture anyway? Like, great question. Very fair because I think we all sort of feel like we know what we're talking about, but my perception of it might be really different than someone else's. And so, they say when we're talking about culture, in any respect, it seems very different from what they mean when they say company culture. All throughout, one of the phrases that sticks with me is culture is the worst behavior your organization is willing to tolerate. Not the most aspirational definition of culture, but I actually think it's kind of a phenomenal definition when you think about it because it's not necessarily what's on your like values, that are like always very aspirational, but how it is lived day to day. But curious from any of you if you want to jump in with like what your kind of working definition of culture is so that people kind of we can get one level more precise.
I'll just jump in for a quick second. 'Cause the best definition I heard when I was working in companies as a compliance officer was it's what happens when nobody's looking. Because
Mm.
it's the way it really works. And you can have your code, but as we all know, that can be an empty set of words unless there's a real effort to make sure that people walk the walk and talk the talk both.
Doug, Ryan, anything to add?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we think of it as concentric circles here at Ethisphere. So you have your organizational culture, which is broadly speaking, and this is kind of the textbook MBA definition, which is somewhat dry, but it's the way things are done at the organization. And then we narrow that focus somewhat to look at the ethical culture as we define it. And that's really what are the moral decisions what's the environment with which shapes moral decisions being made day to day on a day-to-day basis. It's really the DNA of the organization in terms of shared values, norms, and we view it as comprised of two main things. It's not only a mindset or perceptions of your employees, which we look to measure in depth, but it's also the system underpinning that too. So what's in this case, or in our context, it's a compliance program and what's being set formally by that system. And a lot of what we measure and diagnose and try to improve upon is where are you seeing a disconnect between the formal systems and informal systems between that? So the perceptions in the system and a lot of the disconnects we see kind of break down within that gap between formal and informal systems. So that's kind of a framework that we view it as. But certainly, Ryan, I think I may have cut you off, so I apologize for that.
No. You summed it. Both of you summed it up perfectly. So I will allow a time rather than regurgitating my thoughts. We can move on.
Love that. Okay, perfect. Ace, if you don't mind going to now perfect. Okay, so, and please, folks, do keep the questions coming. I think they're phenomenal, and I'll try to pepper them in throughout. And so we promised some data, and so we can start with kind of the manager conundrum, which I think can be summed up as managers are the ethical middle, they're the front lines. This is some of the data that Doug is going to share throughout. But I think, Ryan, you said it well, like they're very overloaded. They may be hearing multiple messages. And I think, I'm curious if folks in the chat agree, but I think that that is only getting more intense. I can just share an anecdote from like my sort of CEO vantage point is I'm just hearing data of, for example, sales managers now being able to take on even more direct reports because with AI, the idea is you can automate some of the grunt work. So that means that, your span of control may be increasing. A lot of these layoffs, Doug, that you referred to often are hitting middle managers. That's like very specifically what companies are looking to reduce. And so my perspective would be that, to the extent this is already hard, one can imagine it likely getting harder just because increased span of control. Let me see. I had, of course, a very logical way that I was going to go about this, and then I start to get in and get interested and get off track. Doug, over to you first for just like what do you want to share in terms of what data really you think most tells this story of managers being so important?
Yeah, I love the point you made, Roxanne, about how the message of managers matter. I mean, no one's going to refute that, and it's something we've been espousing for at this point years. And I think those on the line today, there's really no contention behind that statement. But where we find we can add value is what's the data to support that statement,
Mm,
and it starts first of all looking at what we call the speak up gap. And what we found in our broader data, setting managers aside for just a moment, is that when we survey folks around the world and getting their perceptions of ethics, compliance, integrity overall, we ask employees, are you willing to report misconduct if you see it, hypothetically? And they're like, of course. 93% say, of course I would. When you're outside that situation, outside that moment, it's very easy to imagine yourself doing the right thing. Now, also have a series of questions that go down a skip logic path saying, all right, do you think you saw something this past year that may be considered misconduct in your perspective? And for those who do, we ask them, okay, did you actually report what you saw or ask questions about it? And the proportion of those folks that say they reported is 50%. So almost half. It's a dramatic shift between those who think they're willing to in a hypothetical sense versus those who, when put in that situation, go forward with raising their hand and saying something. And if you'll indulge me for a moment for doing some shameless self-promotion, Ethisphere put out a great Speak Up Culture data report on this fact that's available on our website, complimentary, but we highlight that fact and more within that report. And where managers come into play is what we found is for those employees, and I think Ryan, you touched on this point as well, for those employees who we assess that say, my manager engages with me at least on a monthly basis on the topic of integrity, that at least they remember or can recall, versus those who never, we see some dramatically different results within that speak up gap. So uh, to the point where we see um, 20, there's a 21 point difference between those who are willing to report if their managers are having that conversation. If you're engaging with your reports on a regular basis on integrity, the values, why it matters, how it's integrated in the work you do, we're seeing again a 21 point improvement in those willing to report. Um, Now, when it comes down to folks who are actually reporting, it's twice as more likely to report if they're having that more frequent conversation with their manager. Huge impact if you're having that dedicated conversation, if you're setting aside the time to make it a priority in your discussions. in your weekly stand-ups, in your one-on-one meetings, there's real tangible results. And the list goes on. We also measure perceptions of pressure. So as an employee of the organization, do I feel pressure in my day job to compromise the code or the rules just to get my job done? And for those who are, again, engaging with their manager in that conversation, there's a 20 points less likely to feel that pressure. And similar results are found for perceptions of retaliation, for belief that the organization follows through on investigations, confidence in the reporting process. It goes on and on. It really is at the center of significant change, a perception of whether their manager is engaging with these conversations, which as a proxy is how they view them. How many managers are having these conversations? And I think as the slide points out, roughly 2 out of every 5 employees that we survey say their managers are engaging on a monthly basis. So there's a lot of runway to improve. There's less than half of the managers are, at least from our data set, are saying they're engaging with their employees on this point. So yeah, Roxanne, a lot of evidence to support that managers really do matter, and the data backs it up.
Susan, Ryan, do you have kind of any stories, anonymized or otherwise that bring, what Doug is saying about how important managers are, like more in a kind of more visceral, like storytelling sense?
Sure. I mean, I totally agree with Doug on everything he's saying and glad that we have the data to back it up. But I'd also point to 2 fairly dramatic examples that have been in the press over and over again. And one is Boeing.
Mm,
And from reading the emails that Boeing test pilots and others sent that
Mm,
were revealed in the congressional hearings, they knew that the plane they were pushing out the door, the 737 MAX, was flawed. They actually said in their chat, "Would you let your family fly on this? I wouldn't." And these
mm,
were pretty senior managers in the quality assurance program, but clearly they didn't feel that they could be the people to go lay down across the railroad tracks when the locomotive was coming and say, stop. Um, and I started to view it after seeing that and seeing some examples in real life more as a risk issue, which I think can be a good thing to do. If you have employees that are or middle managers and employees working in very sensitive areas, and you know that there's pressure, well, that's a time to go and have some pretty frank behind closed doors chats. And I'll stop with one other example, but one time Brackett Dennison, who had been one of the legendary counsels at GE, told the story of his team at Fukushima reactor before it actually blew up in the tsunami, feeling that they couldn't put data into their reports because it would shame the clients on the other side, who happened to be Fukushima reactor. Um,
mm.
and GE, as we all know, back in those days, took enormous effort to put in place a good program, to do training, to do absolutely everything they could think of, but it's still going to be a risk. And sort of really viewing it as a risk in those types of contracts or those types of activities, whatever it is, and making sure that you spend the time to figure out if something is going sideways, I think is really important.
Before I toss it over to Ryan, Susan, quick follow-up there. When you say reframing it as risk, maybe versus, I'm assuming ethics or compliance or something, is the reframe that you think is helpful that often when you're in a safety culture, this is the Army had this, there's a recognition that there's no risk-free activity. Like you wouldn't be asking the question, are there any issues in our organization? You would be asking what's the highest likelihood that where we're going to have it, or like you would be framing it as this is inevitable, which then changes your perception of I'm looking for something that I know will be there versus like I can pretend that there will be no issues. Is that the idea of framing it for risk, or is it something else? Because I think it's an important distinction.
Yeah, that's a really good framing, Roxanne. And I think that's a helpful perspective to bring to bear that it's going to be there. And the question is, if you're the next level up of managers, do you go and have frank, behind closed doors conversations with the people who are on the line or managing those on the line and say, are you feeling a lot of pressure in this circumstance as we're trying to push planes out? Or Wells Fargo is another example, which I'll leave for now. to open accounts. If you ask those questions, I think eventually somebody's going to tell you that they feel under enormous pressure. And then you go from there to sort of see what that actually means in practice. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. Ryan, anything to add here?
Yeah, I just think as I'm listening to you all and also looking at the slide, that third box stands out to me of like 39% of employees say their managers talk to them about ethics regularly. And I've done some digging into this, not specifically at Visa, but at other corporations. Like, why don't you? Right? If you aren't, sometimes it's what I talked about before, like, but I feel like I do. And
Mm,
it's just not hitting to the employees. But also, I think managers understand there's so much complexity and compliance and ethics that they're like, I don't want to get it wrong.
yeah.
So, in the absence, and this gets to kind of something I'll talk to you later in terms of our team philosophy about like, what do we need to do to help managers feel like they're ready? Like, how simple can we make this for them? But I think there's also hesitation there of, hey, I'm feeling a lot of pressure, but again, this goes back to like, can you make a mistake in your corporation? And sometimes those ethics and compliance ones can be either very costly or very damaging in other ways.
I think
I
that's a really good point, if I can interrupt for a second, that really needs stressing, that demystifying ethics and compliance is really important. And if your ethics and compliance program is wrapped in references to the federal code or the CFR, then it's not demystified, but really
Yeah.
making an effort to say anybody can talk about ethics. And here are our values. What do they mean to you? I think that's important, Ryan.
Yeah.
I love that. And it segues perfectly to the next slide, Ace, if you could go there. So we also got a question, which I think kind of gets at maybe one way you could help managers have more conversations, like increase that stat we were just looking at. So the question is essentially, what are the best practices around communicating ethics cases within the rest of the organization? And I think this connects because I would imagine that sometimes ethics is very abstract. But if you gave to pick on sales manager an example of like, hey, last year at our organization, this thing happened, and I'm going to give it to you in an anonymized way, and I want you to go talk to your team about why this was an example of backdating contracts that was really problematic, and here's, kind of what we did, and here's what we learned. Then you're not saying to the managers in the abstract, talk about ethics. You're saying, here's a perfect little case study that, is very relevant because it literally happened here. What do you all see as a best practice around either feeding managers anonymous examples that have happened or something else to make it to make it really easy for them to do this? Let's
I
be a
think,
jump.
okay, I think the ease, I've had a good breakfast this morning, so I'll jump for the ball. But it's something we used to do with our program. It's in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs guidance from DOJ, which is still intact and out there. And I think it's absolutely essential because it's real. And it says this is what happened. And you can include, near misses as well as actual things that happened. And if you find that you're in the situation where you have to fire a senior manager or a senior leader, if you don't message that, it will get messaged one way or another. So it's important to message it as an example of the company making hard decisions. Hopefully they did.
Doug, Ryan, anything else you want to add on that?
I interrupted you last time,
Sorry, and it
Ryan.
flickered through my brain.
Very
We'll get you
courteous.
back, Doug.
So Doug, you go and I'll try and
Ju-
refresh my memory of what I was going to say.
Very
Sorry,
good.
Ryan.
So I saw the question come in too, Roxanne. It seems like the question was regarding how do you communicate, or what are some practices we see in informing the entire organization of ethics cases
Yep.
and ways to approach that. So one of the grade A plus versions of this that I've seen, and I'll give you all a concrete example here in a moment, is we've seen some of the leading organizations that we recognize as part of our World's Most Ethical Companies program is those who have crafted a dedicated integrity annual integrity report that features in somewhat depth in
Mm.
cases, number of hotline activity, amount of hotline activity coming in, the nature of that, the resolutions behind those, what resulted from that. A lot of times these reports will contain references to recent culture survey findings or engagement survey anecdotes that were relevant to integrity overall. And the purpose of those reports is in a few different goals behind it. One, it provides it eliminates the black box effect of what happens when you report. One of the most common objections to reporting misconduct that our data tells us is folks aren't convinced anything will happen if they raise their hands.
Yeah.
Having a widespread report that goes into depth behind some of these, not only processes, but data behind what's the organization has experienced, really shines light on the fact that yes, this happens here. Here's what comes out of it. It's a legitimate, trusted process. Some of the better reports will go into depth as to what you can experience if you yourself have to raise your hand. Here's kind of the process. Here's the follow through or follow up, if you are anonymous or not, whatever the path of logic may be. But again, it provides a lot of great transparency behind what takes place in that. And some of the best organizations that put these together will share them publicly. They'll not only share them internally with all employees, but they'll post them on their website. And if anyone wants a quick example to reference after the webinar, of course, hang with us. Care First has an annual Speak Up report that's posted publicly on their website. You can Google Care First Speak Up report. I think 2024 is still the latest version of that. Great example of an organization who put one together that summarizes a lot of what I just talked about and is a great practice for illustrating and dedicating real resources behind ethics cases and what it may look like. So yeah, that's kind of a great.
Love that example. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. And you actually brought back all the things, the points that I wanted to say in your, I want to absolutely acknowledge, because I've worked at more than one organization who, if you said, hey, let's put these numbers out publicly, they'd be like, whoa, right? So absolutely there is hesitancy on the part of our organizations to put these numbers out there. So two things that we've done recently, because my current organization, Visa, is right, like maybe not ready to go all curtains open. Is one, we did, I reworked our Speak Up campaign so that when we went in and talked to various groups around the organization, we specifically, and using, yes, information from Ethisphere, looked at what are those top concerns that people have. And instead of saying, like, we want you to come to us for this, this, and this, and we take care of it, we specifically addressed it as like, hey, fear that nothing would happen, fear of retaliation, fear, right? So that was another way that we just kind of worked through and got a lot of good feedback from our employees of like, oh, okay, right? Like you actually spoke to something of like why I would not speak up. Mm. The other one is we did a recent leader video for our ethics and compliance week where we actually asked leaders, like, talk about a time in your career where you had an ethical dilemma and got them to tell a story, which I think feels a little maybe less risky to the leadership of, and got a great example of somebody who said if they were early in their career actually at Visa, and told a story of a client who is still a client, and the guy very respectfully said, I can't do what you're asking me to do, and here's why. Right, and explained it from the Visa perspective. And he said, I still have a great working relationship with this person today. And he appreciated that I took the stand that I did. And I think that, again, makes it okay to say, hey, maybe it's not always about the, right? Like you're not serving the customer well, like in the Fukushima example, if you're avoiding talking about these things.
I love, Ryan, that you brought that in. One, because it's so specific, and two, it sort of reminds us we're all actually just children and we want story time. Like abstract ideas are kind of like, but it's true. Like I mean, I've got little kids too, Doug, and like they stories resonate. And so this example of a leader not just saying, at Visa, this is so important to us, but instead saying story time. Once upon a time when I was, but a young like person here, I just think sometimes we can forget how impactful those are. And maybe Ace, if you could jump to slide 7, because I think we're kind of already transitioning from like, there's universal consensus, managers matter a ton. And so I want to make sure we spend the rest of the time we have on kind of like, cool, what do we do about that? Because, it just seems like the data, Doug, that you and others bring is overwhelming here. And so Ryan, you already came up with a great example here, which is like empower them with stories from the top. And I'm curious, Doug or Susan, if kind of anything jumps out to you. You know, Doug, you gave the example of like the company can support with like a full speak up culture report if that's a place the company is comfortable with. What are some other tools and tips that you've seen work really well for how to really support managers?
Well, one quick one that we've learned along the way is, as you alluded to, Roxanne, at the very beginning, is managers are stretched thin. They're extremely busy. They're getting hit from above and below with responsibilities, with asks. You've got to make it as turnkey and as simple as humanly possible. And the piece of guidance that we always lean on when our culture data shows for any given organization that your managers are really the linchpin to focus on, given your data, is how can you interject an ethics or integrity moment in an existing meeting cadence? Don't schedule a brand new weekly meeting with your team. Don't burden them with another reoccurring 30-minute, 15-minute conversation for teams that are already stretched thin. Borrow from the safety team model, whereas start every meeting with a 30-second, 90-second, 1 minute integrity moment. Share a story, highlight a company value, lean into it as a practice in existing meetings so that there's as little friction as possible when integrating this into your conversation. So that's not necessarily an example, but more of kind of a guiding principle as you enact something like this that we've seen work better across a lot of different companies.
I love that because I think sometimes companies equate sort of length of training with impact, and I feel like actually there can almost be a bit of a like inverse correlation, just given what we're saying, which is managers are incredibly loaded with other tasks. Susan, I saw that you had something here.
Yeah, and Doug, I want you to know that it was really tempting to interrupt you, but I didn't. And that was
Susan's gonna
an
get you back.
ethical decision on my part. Um, but one thing that I actually sort of have a pet peeve because of my long career in this area is that more companies haven't put in place in their performance reviews, bonus awards, and promotions ethical criteria. Um, yeah, and the Department of Justice guidance has had that now for several years. But as I look at the stats, and I used to head research at LRN, and so I saw the stats, and I don't know what Doug's data says immediately about this, but a lot of companies haven't made ethics and compliant behavior a factor in performance. So what matters gets measured. And if your whole performance system is all about being on time and getting results and whatever else, um, and ethics isn't mentioned, that makes it hard in the company, I think. And that's a good place to actually have recognition. I think you have to do it well. You can't just make it check the box. And I know one biotech company that held managers accountable if people in their chain were guilty of misconduct, and that reflected in their performance reviews. And I think that was taking it yet another step forward and a good idea. But I think it's time that people really made sure that they are doing that.
Susan, I think you hit on a hot topic 'cause we got a couple like agreements in question. So maybe going one step further, let's say you're an organization, you get buy-in for, yeah, we're going to incorporate some version of a ethics and compliance component into our performance reviews. We got a question that is like, what measurable E&C metric might you use to do that, you know? Like I think Susan, when we were at a previous event, I mentioned that the Army at one point had some sort of it was literally a box and you literally did check it of like I'm an ethical or like you know the person I'm rating is ethical and I think you had to just like really do something quite horrendous to not get that box checked. And so it's almost like it's taking your idea, but unfortunately the way it's put in practice, there was no metric associated with it. There wasn't anything, you know, even attempting to tie it to like how many issues had your unit had or anything like that. It was and so, you know, any ideas you all have as to how you might implement this in a way that's a bit more impactful?
I'll jump in, but Ryan, you looked like you wanted to say something? No? Well, I think the best method I've seen for putting this into performance metrics in a meaningful way is to talk about it at all levels of the company and say, well, what are the ethical actions and qualities that you most want to see, and really crowdsource it. Now, it takes a long time, but once you've got something that you can work with, you can keep refreshing it and redirecting it. But do you give people on your team enough time to talk and raise issues? Do you make hard choices? Can you give any examples of that? Do you ensure that you're balancing business goals with values? I mean, I think there's a whole, and you can use Doug's culture survey, which he developed to measure a fair amount of that. And I can talk later about what Lincoln Financial does, where they take data from culture surveys and from other stats, such as whether people on your team actually finish training quickly or let it drag for years or months or whatever. And that is an indicator too. If you've got a team that does its ethics training right away, obviously that says something about being a good corporate citizen. So I think there's all kinds of ways you can do it, and some may be unique to your culture, but some are probably universal too.
I love that. Doug, Ryan?
I've got a few examples. Full disclosure, I don't know if they're great examples, but they're the most recent ones. So I'll
It's
just
okay, we're
talk to what I've seen.
candid conversations. Yeah.
But not to belie the importance of this. I like to quote the late great Charlie Munger had a saying where if as a manager, if you can focus on incentives, that's really all you should be focused on. And
Mm,
that it drives so much of behavior
mm,
overall that you should never underplay incentives as a concept.
Hmm.
With that in mind, we're seeing this increase the number of organizations adopting performance-based incentives or criteria tied to integrity or compliance is increasing, albeit slowly. And there's really two ways to approach it. There's, of course, the proverbial carrot versus stick approach. Carrot, in a sense that are you getting additional recognition and bonuses by executing some behavior, or through the stick method, are you being, demerited from your allocated bonus pool based upon some criteria you didn't get. So there's two ways you can kind of think about it, as a negative or positive different reinforcement technique. We've seen both work, or at least both in practice. And the most recent ones, and I think Susan, you covered some of these already. I'm not going to name them, but there's about 3 organizations that we work with today that have integrated Ethisphere's culture results into senior leadership's performance evaluation. So they take a longitudinal look as to how did your division perform in our criteria over time, and that comprises X% of your performance score. So there's a direct connection between team survey results on specific ethical dimensions and performance rating for that leader. So that's one. The second one, again, Susan, you touched on this, was percentage of your team that's completed the required compliance training. And so for this organization, which happened to be an engineering company we recently worked with, they used less than 3% of the overall leadership bonus pool was tied to an integrity dimension. And a part of that was compliance training. And I'm struggling to think what else comprised that dimension, but there was concrete dollars set aside specifically for the integrity value of that organization and adhering to it, as measured through compliance training, but also through some other dimension. It may have been whether or not misconduct occurred. I'm oversimplifying it. And we've seen those work. But to your point, it's once organizations invest real dollars behind these programs, it sends an incredibly strong signal that it's valued, it's important, and it goes beyond just values and words, but ties to actions, which is important.
Wonderful. All right, so we've got that performance is one idea. Ryan, you had talked about in the prep call the idea of a people leader toolkit, which kind of gets to what Doug was saying earlier about making this really turnkey. Could you share a little bit more about that, how you've seen it work, maybe any challenges?
Yeah, I think we've got a slide on that
Yes.
too.
Sorry, Ace,
You
I
want to
think it
go for
is perfect. Thank you.
it?
And then
There we
Doug, I'll promise I'll go back to Dell.
go. Yeah, thank you. So we were kind of brainstorming for the beginning of the calendar year, kind of right. You get all the resolutions and restarting, and so this year we tried putting out a little bit of a toolkit. It was, I call it toolkit. It was an email with some very specific asks, right? Again, like including this story time aspect of like, you don't have to belabor this, folks. You could just pull up like, hey, today I want to talk about a boss of mine that I just thought led with such brilliant ethics, or hey, here is a dilemma that I had. And then again, like the other kind of lighter side is that we put together a trivia deck, trying to get at this aspect of, ooh, but I don't know what to talk about. If I have to come up with something on my own, I'm likely not to do it. And so we were trying to do very short, brief things that they could do. So the trivia deck was literally like 5 questions. We have the answers marked out for you. I made them easy enough that, right, like they shouldn't have necessarily sparked a ton of like, well, what about this? And what about this? Right, like this will work for you. I would say, right, so I think we hit the ease side of it well. We didn't have a great way to measure utilization, right? Maybe emails opened we can look at, but I think next time I would do a little bit more of a click through of like how many people click through to get the deck rather than having it attached. Just as a simple way to kind of try to get some metrics. And then it came from the ethics and compliance team. So no real executive sponsorship there, which can be certainly, as we all know, that tone from the top can be very, very helpful. And then again, right, it is another incremental ask. So one of the goals that we have in the ethics and compliance department is really working cross-functionally with, okay, HR, if performance reviews are coming up, or whatever, what are the other things that happen in kind of the ecosystem of a fiscal year that we can plug a little bit of a message into so that it's not all these different groups are hitting me all the time.
I love that. And your second point about sort of like no executive sponsorship just makes me think of an idea that Daryl from Klaviyo shared at a case study we have that I thought was really sharp and also kind of dug us to your turnkey idea. So what he did is he embedded senior leaders, but not just the CEO. It might be like the chief people officer or the head of, the Boston office, whatever, whoever was sort of seen as like a culture carrier who might really be noticed in that organization. Because, at a large organization, maybe very few people might have a personal relationship with the CEO, but they, likely know their department head. And he just put the turnkey ideas that he made the script and made it really clear what they could say. Of course, they could ad lib, and then incorporated them throughout their code of conduct training. And I thought that was a really nice idea to kind of bring in different voices. And then, as he said it, it also gets more executive buy-in in the training themselves, right? Like executives love to be on a camera typically, but once they are involved, they also want the thing to be good. Like they're now invested, because you've kind of conscripted me into this activity. So I thought that was just a nice idea of like maybe one sort of actionable and relatively low lift way to bring executive sponsors in, because I think as you all well know, your sort of peers might not necessarily volunteer themselves into these roles, but if you make it really easy. Let me pause for reactions if anyone has any.
Uh, Reaction to Ryan's
Uh,
comment.
Please.
yeah, go ahead.
Just Ryan, just want to say thank you for being so candid with what didn't land. It's very rare to see that, lessons learned so clearly shared in a webinar context. So I just want to say thank you for sharing that. That's very candid and very appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing that I am always striving for in ethics and compliance, and especially as somebody who manages training, because I am very realistic that nobody's coming in like super excited to take their annual mandatory training, is like, how do we in these, whether it's in training examples or outside of that, how do we build a little bit of fun in? So again, with that leader video that I referenced earlier, we also asked our leaders to record a tiny little segment of like, hey, if you were in charge of snacks for Ethics and Compliance Week, what would you serve? And again, it's that, hey, they did this for us. It's a little silly, but it also allowed me to, as a teaser to a video for Ethics and Compliance Week, to say, hey, what would so-and-so, what would our chief legal counsel bring to the table for Ethics and Compliance Week in terms of snacks? And so all of those little hooks to get to draw people in to doing that, and maybe a manager watches it and it was like, oh, that was actually really interesting. And again, is that turnkey idea, let me play it at a team meeting, things like that.
I love that, Ryan, because you're demystifying compliance and ethics, and you're letting people be people and real.
Yeah.
So I think that's brilliant.
And to Doug's point, I think you're role modeling it here. I think sometimes there can be this perception that in ethics and compliance, everything kind of has to be like perfect, otherwise it's not shared. But this is just pure anecdote, no data to back it up. Doug, please find a stat to tell me that I'm correct. Um, but I think that employees really do gravitate toward any amount of vulnerability or honesty, especially from senior leadership. Like I heard someone else say that they never want to hear a sort of ethics story that didn't have any tension, right? So if it's like the challenges in the tension, so like I was new to this job and I just signed a mortgage and then my boss asked me to do X. That's the challenge that many managers are either facing or their employees are facing. And it's not, I was, given a really easy option to do the right thing. Gosh, what should I do? And so I love just like really reminding ourselves of that.
Yeah, it's such a great point, Roxanne. We did a generational gap or a generational assessment in our culture data a couple years ago. And not to zoom us out too far here, but in an era where we're on TikTok and social media, we really all crave authenticity and we know it when we see it. And it's so important. I think, Susan, you made the same point, is that these need to come from the leader's own voice and their own tone, and employees know when it's not. Um, we get a lot of surprisingly, we get comments about, we look at a lot of code of conducts too, and the codes of conduct too, and so in the work that we do. And when discussing it with employees, we get a lot of complaints or comments about employees know when you're using stock photography in your code of conduct versus actual imagery. Things like that resonate. People know when it's and you're being authentic, when there's real resources behind something, and they crave that and they can sense that too. So this is a very convoluted way of saying I double down on your point that authenticity and voice matter for sure.
I love that. Let's see, we have one more pulse question. This is sort of just for again, group getting an understanding. So we have effective tools or incentives in place to help managers model and reinforce company values. Five would be a strongly agree. Would just love to see kind of where folks are in this journey. Admittedly, it sounds like this is it's really tricky to think about, even though incentives are so important, how to make them correct, accurate, not just a checkbox activity. So truly no judgment if you're sort of more on the one, two, three side. And just seeing a couple of folks, it does seem like this is where a lot of folks are at. I'll give a quick plug to Ethena has a compliance roundtable coming up with a chief compliance officer who's actually talking about reward carrots and sticks in compliance. So we can definitely send that out after. I think this is just like I think in the spirit of candor that Ryan kicked off, I've never really heard anyone, myself included, feel like they've nailed this. So I think it's more a iterate and experiment versus the answer is X. I haven't seen that. I'm curious to the panelists if you've seen like the right answer is X, if only companies would get there, or if this is more like it's just a really tricky question.
I think it's a really tricky
I
question,
do.
Roxanne, and it can vary from company to company and industry to industry.
Love that.
Yes, I am definitely a five on it being a tricky question on our scale on
Thank
the
you.
slide.
Thank you for playing along. Doug, anything there?
Um, no, I have nothing to add.
Yeah.
Finally.
Yeah. And Ace, if you can go one slide forward to the point on turnkey, to the extent you're interested, Ethisphere partnered with Ethena to create a turnkey training on very specifically focused on managers. I think I'll call it a couple of things, which is it is short. You can look at it as 15 minutes, but beyond that, it is hyper customizable. And I think, my personal perspective is that customizing it is really the only way to roll it out. Some amazing tips that we've already heard in this panel to customize any training, but this would be an ideal part, is real life stories from, any of your senior leaders who are kind of willing to share in an authentic voice a challenge that they faced. And then also, to the extent you can get comfortable with it, some anonymous examples of challenges your organization has faced in the past year. And so a manager doesn't feel like you're talking about something abstract, but instead they see, a real life scenario. A manager was faced with this, an employee brought forward this scenario, and you can just kind of play that out in customization instead of keeping things at kind of a bit of an abstract high level that might not resonate with that manager who doesn't think about ethics and compliance all day. I am always committed to getting folks out on time. I see you have a question on how do we access it. I'm sure, Ace, we could send a link now or afterwards. So I will trust that. Thanks, folks. We'll stay on for like 2 more minutes. If anyone had a question, I'll make sure in the Q&A I got to them all. But feel free to drop any questions in chat. And otherwise, I want to thank so much our three panelists for presenting their just really thoughtful, candid perspectives on such an important issue.
That was
We
great,
can,
Roxanne. So glad we got a chance
Yeah,
to talk about it.
I agree.
thank you.
We
A
can
short but quick. I feel like we scratched the surface, and so more work for all of us. Um,
definitely. We may need a 201 later.
right.
Wonderful. Okay. I'll let folks stay on for just a minute in case anyone has questions, but feel free to drop. We'll be sure to send all of the follow-up materials as resources to the extent that they're helpful. All right. I'll let everyone get to their next meeting, but thank you so much again to the panelists
Thanks.
and to such a thoughtful crowd. This was really fun. Bye,
It was
everyone.
fun to work with everybody.
I agree.
Likewise. Thanks all. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.